Well, good morning again, everyone. Great words of reflection in that song, aren't they? I wanted to start by showing a few pictures to you all. Maybe the younger ones would enjoy looking at these. So let's have the first one of those up now, please. On the next slide. I wonder what you think this is. So what do you see when you look at this? Do you see a rabbit or do you see a duck? Wonder what conversations you have got going on in your house at the moment. It was duck in our house, but let's have the next one. So what do we see here? Do we see two vases? Two faces, or do we see one vase in the middle? There was a split decision in the Hambleton household earlier when we looked at this one. And then finally, what about this one? Do we see an old woman or do we see a young woman? It was certainly a young woman that we saw in our house, but perhaps you can also see the older woman there. I was going to point at my screen, that wouldn't work, would it? The side of the woman's face becomes the older woman's nose. I said earlier when Laura came in, I always look at her and see a beautiful young woman. But what about this final one? What do we see here? It's one of the most recognizable symbols in the world, isn't it? The cross of Jesus, and yet when people look at it, they see something very different. For some, they look at this and they see it as an instrument of torture. To them, it's nothing more than a brutal torturing and execution device designed by the Romans. Or perhaps it's a symbol of weakness and of failure, of disappointment. Everything about a cross and someone dying on it just screams out defeat and failure, nothing to be proud of. Or it's just plain stupidness, it's foolishness. That's not what God should be like, is it? But then for the Christian, they see something different. They see the cross as being the power and the wisdom of God, the very opposite of weakness and foolishness that other people see. Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, that's exactly what we see, isn't it? We see different responses to the cross of Jesus. We see the response of the Jews, we see the response of the Greeks, and we see the response of those who have had their eyes opened by the Holy Spirit, those who can see the cross as it really is. Well, I invite you this morning to come with me to that very cross on Easter Friday. Let's stand at the foot of that cross together. You can hear the groans of people who were crucified. Let's mingle in those crowds and eavesdrop on their conversations that are going on that hillside out of Jerusalem. And let's go as well into the church in Corinth as people discuss what the cross really means. So firstly, let's huddle in with those Jewish people. What do they think is going on? Well, for them, the image of Jesus dying on the cross is absolutely conclusive. For the Jews, they demand a miraculous sign. So for this absolutely confirms that this Jesus of Nazareth isn't who he claimed to be. It's proof beyond all reasonable doubt that Jesus was just another charlatan, just another would-be Messiah who came and made the right noises, said all the right things, ticked a few of those prophetic boxes, but who ultimately fell short of what God's promised Messiah would really be like. And that's what it was like on the first Good Friday, wasn't it? A couple of weeks ago in our home group, we were looking at the account of Jesus' death in Matthew 27, which I read early in the service. And that's exactly what we saw, people standing around the cross, hurling insults, mocking him, saying that if he really was the Son of God, then he would get down from that cross. He's on a cross, so he's failure. So let's get close in, let's hear what they are saying. Save yourself, come down from that cross if you are the Son of God. He saved others, but he can't save himself. He's supposed to be a king. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. So you see, for the Jews, there's the prototype of the Messiah, God's rescuing king. And this man on the cross just doesn't live up to that expectation. God's promised king would come to remove the Roman occupation, and he'd be the all-action hero, the warrior king, restoring the nation of Israel to its former glory, as in the time of David, and then some. So for the Jews, they wanted the full performance, the lights, the music, the fireworks, and all of the miracles of heaven on display in God's chosen King. And so Jesus never lived up to that hope, did he? There were glimpses along the way. He performed miracles, yes, but it was never enough. Just one more miracle, Jesus, just to prove that you really are the Son of God, come to save your people. And so later, when Paul was writing to 1 Corinthians, he confronts this, doesn't he? He says that the Jews want a sign, but the cross of Christ will be a stumbling block for them. It's a stumbling block because they don't want a weak God who sends a weak Messiah. They want a miracle machine. And we can be like that too, can't we? Perhaps if you're not a Christian, that's how you are currently approaching God. You're putting it out there all on the line. You're saying, okay, God, I'm here. Let's do business. I'm ready. If you're real, if you're really there, then show me the miracle. Do that thing for me. Make it clear. And then, and only then, will I believe. Well, to those people living in his own day, Jesus said this: there will be no other sign given than this, that Jesus would die and he would rise again. The Jews looking for the miracle machine are searching for this road that doesn't exist. It's the cross and the resurrection, which is the sign of God's true King. That's the sign, that's the proof that Jesus would be crucified, but raised to life. Well, let's move on from this huddle of Jews, and let's go and look at this second group number 2, the Greeks who look for wisdom. They're a bit different from the first group, and I've got to be honest with you, we're a bit intimidated by these people, or at least I am. You see, they are super intelligent. They have been to the best universities. They have got PhDs falling out of their back pockets. They are experts in philosophy. And if you try to go toe to toe with them in a debate, they will soon turn your brain to pretzel. These are the Greeks, and they've got big brains and they have got skilled mouths. Back when I was a teenager, I used to really enjoy getting football magazines. And quite often you would flick through Match magazine or whatever it was, and there would be a silhouette of the perfect football. If we just have a next click, please, Pete. You'd have to fill in each part rather like this in order to build what you thought was the ultimate footballer. And I used to love doing this. And I don't mind telling that one of my secret pleasures on an evening is to watch 1990s football back again on YouTube. But how would you fill in that silhouette? You could have the football brains and intelligence of an Eric Cantona. You'd have the skills of a Matthew Le Tissier. You'd have the dribbling ability of Ryan Giggs. You'd have the tackles from Stuart Pearce. You'd have the right foot of an Alan Shearer. And of course, without doubt, you would have Chris Waddle's free kicks and David Hirst's left foot. You could build the ultimate footballer. And I used to love doing that. But it turns out that the Greeks were playing that game way before the 1990s, not with footballers, but with gods. They loved to build their own gods in their own image. Gods that were strong, gods that were angry, gods that were virile, gods that above all else were wise. The Greeks prized their wisdom. That's what philosophy is. It literally means a love of wisdom. And so the best God was the wisest, most intelligent, most eloquent God that you could imagine, because that's what the Greeks loved most of all. And that is what the Corinthians loved most of all, which is why Paul opens this letter to the church in Corinth with an examination of what true wisdom really is. Here's a book that I read a few years ago, which I really enjoyed. It's called The Elements of Eloquence. And it's all about what the Greeks called the figures of rhetoric. Now, that sounds really boring, but actually it's a very witty, very funny book. You see, the Greeks just didn't want to be wise and look wise. They wanted to sound wise as well. And so the slogan, the motto of the city of Corinth was this: to the wise man belongs all things. And for that, they studied how they could build speeches that were impressive and persuasive. That was a culture of Corinth, which Paul was writing to. So in those first two chapters of his letter to Corinthians that Maureen was reading from earlier, Paul refers to wisdom, false wisdom or true wisdom, on no less than 20 occasions. He wanted his preaching to be different from this eloquent wisdom that the Greeks were trying to talk about in their speeches. He wanted his preaching not to be simplistic, but definitely clear, not full of manipulative and puffed up language. And so these wise men in Corinth had invented a wise God, a God in their own image. And this God was wise, but he was also what the Greeks would call apatheia. He was apathetic. They wanted a God who was intelligent and completely untouchable. He was cold, he was distant, not troubled by the silly games played by mere mortals down on earth. And so for that group number 2, discussing the cross here and what it means, if they see a God who is loving and involved and down on earth and clothed in humanity and suffering and dying, what did they think? Well, they thought it was absolutely a contradiction in terms. You can't have a God who feels pain. You can't have a God on earth. You can't have a God who subjects himself to human cruelty. You can't have a God who suffers. You can't have a God who dies. All of these things, everything about the cross. Do you know what it is to the Greeks? It's just plain foolishness. Why? Because we can get our silhouette of God out and we can build a God that we think is so much better than that. One that is clever and one that is strong and one that is impressive. Nothing like Jesus on the cross. But what does Paul say to that? Well, the people in this group are building this really impressive road, aren't they? The Jews were looking for a road that wasn't there, but the Greeks were building a road, a really impressive road, but it was a road that ultimately would lead to nowhere. Look at verse 21 in that passage. The world in its wisdom has not and cannot discover God. So I ask you, is that what you're doing? Are you trying to find a God through your own wisdom and intellect? Are you building a God in your own image, a God who is just an extension of yourself with all the weak bits taken out, just like the Greeks were doing? Well, finally, we come to a third group of people around the cross, a third group of people in that city of Corinth. And these people are the people who preach Christ crucified. These people look at that cross and they see something very different. Where the Jews have seen a stumbling block, they see power. Where the Greeks have seen foolishness, they see wisdom. And what's funny is that this third group of people is made up of people where, it's from the first two groups. There's all sorts of people in there, and there are Jews in this group, and there are Greeks and Gentiles in this group, but they have begun to see things differently. They've begun to see the cross of Jesus in a new light. Look at verse 24. But to those whom God has called, both the Jew and the Greek, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. But how does that happen? What's happened there? How have they changed their perspective on what they see when they look at the cross? Well, if you read through chapter 2 of 1 Corinthians, you would see a very, very clear answer to that question. And it's this: it is the work of the Holy Spirit to awaken dead and blind people, dead and blind Greeks, and dead and blind Jews to the truth about who Jesus really is. 1 Corinthians 2 verse 10 says this, that God has revealed it to us by his Spirit. And then reading on from Verse 12. What we have received is not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may understand what God has freely given us. This is what we speak, not in words taught by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit, explaining spiritual realities with Spirit-taught words. The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness and cannot understand them, because they are discerned only through the Spirit. So who is this third group of people then? Well, it is the Church of Jesus Christ. It's those who have been called by God, and through the work of the Holy Spirit, they can say that Jesus is Lord. They're people who have trusted in Jesus. They have laid aside their own wisdom and worldly value systems. They've put down their own silhouettes of God and their gods made in their own image. And they have trusted in what, to earthly standards, looked so weak and so foolish. But they have come to find that the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength. So let's finish by turning our eyes back to the cross. What do you see here? Do you see the need for another miracle? Do you need more human wisdom and intelligence and philosophy? Is this going to remain a stumbling block or foolishness to you? Or will you trust in Jesus and him crucified, the true wisdom and power of God, as it says in Romans, for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew and then for the Gentile? Let me close by reading a few verses from Ephesians. For Jesus, he himself is our peace, who has made the two, the Jew and the Gentile, one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new man out of the two, thus making peace, and in this one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to those of you who were far away and peace to those who were near. For through him, we both have access to the Father by the one Spirit. We're going to close our service now by singing The Power of the Cross.